Welcome to this week's short story. I'm Catherine. Today we will be reading another story from my big book of Edith Wharton. The story today is called The Verdict. The Verdict was written in 1908, and it is about an artist named Jack Gisburn, and it's written from the point of view of his friend, a man named Rickham. There's a few words that I wanted to just define before we start that were new to me. One is prestidigitation. That's a long word, prestidigitation. Basically, it means sleight of hand. I looked it up, and it's kind of like magic, performing tricks or illusions for entertainment. Another word is, speaking tubes. Speaking tubes, they probably are what they sound like. I looked it up again. In older homes, to summon the servants, you'd have these tubes, little like air ducts, where you could, it's a pipe, and you could speak into it, and a person far away can hear you very clearly. They do have them in certain children's playgrounds. I've seen them. I've even tried them. They're kind of neat. From a far distance, you can hear the person's voice like they're right there beside you. So that's a speaking tube. And also, at one point, it talks about putting the Russian deerhound's head between his knees. So that's his dog, and a Russian deerhound is a borzoi dog, the Russian dogs. Interesting fact about them is they almost went extinct during the Russian Revolution because they were killed en masse due to their association with aristocracy. So for a long time, a borzoi was a very rare dog. The Verdict by Edith Wharton. I had always thought Jack Gisburn rather a cheap genius, though a good fellow enough, so it was no great surprise to me to hear that in the height of his glory he had dropped his painting, married a rich widow, and established himself in a villa on the Riviera, though I rather thought it would have been Rome or Florence. The height of his glory, that's what the women called it. I can hear Mrs. Gideon Thwing, his last Chicago sitter, deploring his unaccountable abdication. Of course, it's going to send the value of my picture way up, but I don't think of that, Mr. Rickham. The loss to art is all I can think of. The word on Mrs. Thwing's lips multiplied its R's as though they were reflected in an endless vista of mirrors. And it was not only the Mrs. Thwings who mourned. Had not the exquisite Hermia Croft at the last Grafton Gallery show stopped me before Gisburn's moon dancers to say with tears in her eyes, "We shall not look upon its like again"? Well, even through the prism of Hermia's tears, I felt able to face the fact with equanimity. Poor Jack Gisburn. The women had made him, and it was fitting that they should mourn him. Among his own sex, fewer regrets were heard, and in his own trade, hardly a murmur. Professional jealousy? Perhaps, if it were, the honor of the craft was vindicated by little Claude Nutley, who in all good faith brought out in the Burlington a very handsome obituary on Jack, one of those showy articles stocked with random technicalities that I have heard, I won't say by whom, compared to Gisburn's painting, and so, his resolve being apparently irrevocable, the discussion gradually died out, and, as Mrs. Thwing had predicted, the price of Gisburn's went up. It was not till 3 years after that, in the course of a few weeks' idling on the Riviera, it suddenly occurred to me to wonder why Gisburn had given up his painting. On reflection, it really was a tempting problem. To accuse his wife would have been too easy. His fair sitters had been denied the solace of saying that Mrs. Gisburn had dragged him down, for Mrs. Gisburn, as such, had not existed till nearly a year after Jack's resolve had been taken. It might be that he had married her, since he liked his ease, because he didn't want to go on painting, but it would have been hard to prove that he had given up his painting because he had married her. Of course, if she had not dragged him down, she had equally, as Miss Croft contended, failed to lift him up. She had not led him back to the easel, to put the brush into his hand again. What a vocation for a wife! But Mrs. Gisburn apparently appeared to have disdained it, and I felt it might be interesting to find out why. The desultory life of the Riviera lends itself to such purely academic speculations, and having on my way to Monte Carlo caught a glimpse of Jack's balustraded terraces between the pines, I had myself borne thither the next day. I found the couple at tea beneath the palm trees, and Mrs. Gisburn's welcome was so genial that in the ensuing weeks I claimed it frequently. It was not that my hostess was interesting. On that point, I could have given Miss Croft the fullest reassurance. It was just because she was not interesting, if I may be pardoned the bull, that I have found her so. For Jack, all of his life, had been surrounded by interesting women, and they had fostered his art. It had been reared in the hothouse of their adulation, and it was therefore instructive to note what effect the deadening atmosphere of mediocrity, I quote Miss Croft, was having on him. I have mentioned that Mrs. Gisburn was rich, and it was immediately perceptible that her husband was extracting from this circumstance a delicate but substantial satisfaction. It is, as a rule, the people who scorn money who get the most out of it. And Jack's elegant disdain of his wife's big balance enabled him, with an appearance of perfect good breeding, to transmute it into objects of art and luxury. To the latter, I must add, he remained relatively indifferent, but he was buying Renaissance bronzes and 18th century pictures with a discrimination that bespoke the amplest resources. Money's only excuse is to put beauty into circulation, was one of the axioms he had laid down across the Sèvres and silver on an exquisitely appointed luncheon table. When on a latter day I had again run over from Monte Carlo, and Mrs. Gisburn, beaming on him, added, for my enlightenment, "Jack is just so morbidly sensitive to every form of beauty." Poor Jack! It had always been his fate to have women say such things of him. The fact should be set down in extenuation. What struck me now was that for the first time he resented the tone. I had seen him so often basking under similar tributes. Was it the conjugal note that robbed them of their savor? No, for oddly enough it became apparent that he was fond of Mrs. Gisburn, fond enough not to see her absurdity. It was his own absurdity he seemed to be wincing under, his own attitude as an object for garlands and incense. "My dear, since I've chucked painting, people don't say that stuff about me. They say it about Victor Grindle," was his only protest as he rose from the table and strolled out into the sunlit terrace. I glanced after him, struck by his last word. Victor Grindle was, in fact, becoming the man of the moment, as Jack himself, one might put it, had been the man of the hour. The younger artist was said to have formed himself at my friend's feet, and I wondered if a tinge of jealousy underlay the latter's mysterious abdication. But no, for it was not until after that event that the Rose Dewberry drawing rooms had begun to display their Grindles. I turned to Mrs. Gisburn, who had lingered to give a lump of sugar to her spaniel in the dining room. "Why has he chucked painting?" I asked abruptly. She raised her eyebrows with a hint of good-humored surprise. "Oh, he doesn't have to now, you know, and I want him to enjoy himself," she said quite simply. I looked about the spacious white-paneled room, with its famille verte vases, repeating the tones of the pale damask curtains, and its 18th century pastels in delicate faded frames. "Has he chucked his pictures, too? I haven't seen a single one in the house." A slight shade of constraint crossed Mrs. Gisburn's open countenance. "It's his ridiculous modesty, you know. He says they're not fit to have about. He sent them all away except one, my portrait, and that I have to keep upstairs." His ridiculous modesty? Jack's modesty about his pictures? My curiosity was growing like a beanstalk. I said persuasively to my hostess, "I must really see your portrait, you know." She glanced out almost timorously at the terrace where her husband, lounging in a hooded chair, had lit a cigar and drawn the Russian deerhound's head between his knees. "Well, come while he's not looking," she said with a laugh that tried to hide her nervousness, and I followed her between the marble emperors of the hall and up the wide stairs with terracotta nymphs poised among flowers at each landing. In the dimmest corner of her boudoir, amid a profusion of delicate and distinguished objects, hung one of the familiar oval canvases in the inevitable garlanded frame. The mere outline of the frame called up all Gisburn's past. Mrs. Gisburn drew back the window curtains, moved aside a jardinière full of pink azaleas, pushed an armchair away, and said, "If you stand here, you can just manage to see it. I had it over the mantelpiece, but he wouldn't let it stay." Yes, I could just manage to see it. The first portrait of Jack's I had ever had to strain my eyes over. Usually they had a place of honor, say the central panel in a pale window or Rose du Barry drawing room, or a monumental easel placed so that it took the light through the curtains of old Venetian point. The more modest place became the picture better. Yet as my eyes grew accustomed to the half-light, all the characteristic qualities came out, all the hesitations disguised as audacities, the tricks of prestidigitation by which with such consummate skill he managed to divert attention from the real business of the picture to some pretty irrelevance of detail. Mrs. Gisburn presented a neutral surface to work on, forming, as it were, so inevitably the background of her own picture, had lent herself in an unusual degree to the display of this false virtuosity. The picture was one of Jack's strongest, as his admirers would have put it. It represented on his part a swelling of muscles, a congesting of veins, a balancing, straddling, and straining that reminded one of the circus clown's ironic efforts to lift a feather. It met, in short, at every point the demand of lovely women to be painted strongly, because she was tired of being painted sweetly, and yet not to lose an atom of the sweetness. "It's the last he painted, you know," Mrs. Gisburn said with pardonable pride. "The last but one," she corrected herself, "but the other one doesn't count because he destroyed it." Destroyed it? I was about to follow up on this clue when I heard a footstep and saw Jack himself on the threshold. As he stood there, his hands in his pocket of his velveteen coat, the thin brown waves of hair pushed back from his white forehead, his lean sunburnt cheeks furrowed by a smile that lifted the tips of a self-confident mustache, I felt to what a degree he had the same quality as his pictures, the quality of looking cleverer than he was. His wife glanced at him deprecatingly, but his eyes traveled past her to the portrait. "Mr. Rickham wants to see it," she began, as if excusing herself. He shrugged his shoulders, still smiling. "Oh, Rickham found me out long ago," he said lightly. Then passing his arm through mine, "Come and see the rest of the house." He showed it to me with a kind of naive suburban pride, the bathrooms, the speaking tubes, the dress closets, the trouser presses, all the complex simplifications of the millionaire's domestic economy. And whenever my wonder paid the expected tribute, he said, throwing out his chest a little, "Yes, I really don't see how people manage to live without that." Well, it was just the end one might have foreseen for him. Only he was through it all, and in spite of it all, as though he had been through and in spite of his pictures, so handsome, so charming, so disarming, that one longed to cry out, "Be dissatisfied with your leisure," as one had longed to say, "Be dissatisfied with your work." But the cry on my lips, my diagnosis, suffered an unexpected check. "This is my own lair," he said, leading me into a dark plain room at the end of the florid vista. It was square and brown and leathery. No effects, no bric-a-brac, none of the air of posing for reproduction in a picture weekly. Above all, no least sign of ever having been used as a studio. The fact brought home to me the absolute finality of Jack's break with his old life. "Don't you ever dabble with paint any more?" I asked, still looking about for a trace of such activity. "Never," he said briefly. "Or watercolor? Or etching?" His confident eyes grew dim, and his cheeks paled a little under their handsome sunburn. "Never think of it, my dear fellow, any more than if I'd ever touched it with a brush." And his tone told me in a flash that he never thought of anything else. I moved away, instinctively embarrassed at my unexpected discovery. And as I turned, my eye fell on a small picture above the mantelpiece, the only object breaking the plain oak paneling of the room. "Oh, by Jove," I said. A Stroud! It was the sketch of a donkey, an old, tired donkey, standing in the rain under a wall. "By Jove, a Stroud!" I cried. He was silent, but I felt him close behind me, breathing a little quickly. "What a wonder! Made with a dozen lines, but on everlasting foundations. You lucky chap! Where did you get it?" He answered slowly. "Mrs. Stroud gave it to me." "Ah! I didn't know. You even knew the Strouds. He was such an inflexible hermit." "I didn't, till after. She sent for me to paint him when he was dead." "When he was dead? You?" I must have let a little too much amazement escape through my surprise, for he answered with a deprecating laugh. "Yes, she's an awful simpleton, you know, Mrs. Stroud. Her only idea was to have him done by a fashionable painter. Ah, poor Stroud! She thought it the surest way of proclaiming his greatness, of forcing it on a purblind public. And at the moment I was the fashionable painter. Ah, poor Stroud, as you say. Was that his history?" "That was his history. She believed in him, gloried in him, or thought she did. But she couldn't bear not to have all the drawing rooms with her. She couldn't bear the fact that on vanishing days one could always get near enough to see the pictures. Poor woman. She's just a fragment groping for other fragments. Stroud is the only whole I ever knew." "You ever knew? But you said—" Gisburn had a curious smile in his eyes. "Oh, I knew him, and he knew me, only it happened after he was dead." I dropped my voice instinctively. "When she sent for you?" "Yes, quite insensible to the irony. She wanted him vindicated, and by me." He laughed again and threw his head back to look up at the sketch of the donkey. There were days when I couldn't look at the thing, I couldn't face it, but I forced myself to put it here, and now it's cured me. Cured me. That's the reason why I don't dabble any more, my dear Rickham, or rather Stroud himself is the reason." For the first time, my idle curiosity about my companion turned into a serious desire to understand him better. "I wish you'd tell me how it happened," I said. He stood there, looking up at the sketch and twirling between his fingers a cigarette he had forgotten to light. Suddenly he turned to me. "I'd rather like to tell you, because I've always suspected you of loathing my work." I made a deprecating gesture, which he negatived with a good-humored shrug. "Oh, I didn't care a straw when I believed in myself, and now it's an added tie between us." He laughed slightly, without bitterness, and pushed one of the deep armchairs forward. "There, make yourself comfortable, and here are the cigars you like." He placed them at my elbow and continued to wander up and down the room, stopping now and then beneath the picture. "How it happened? I can tell you in 5 minutes. And it didn't take much longer to happen. I can remember now how surprised and pleased I was when I got Mrs. Stroud's note. Of course, deep down, I had always felt there was no one like him. Only I had gone with the stream, echoed the usual platitudes about him, till I half got to think he was a failure, one of the kind that are left behind. By Jove, and he was left behind, because he had come to stay. The rest of us had let ourselves be swept along or go under, but he was high above the current, on everlasting foundations, as you say. Well, I went off to the house in my most egregious mood, rather moved, Lord forgive me, at the pathos of poor Stroud's career of failure being crowned by the glory of my painting him. Of course, I meant to do the picture for nothing. I told Mrs. Stroud so when she began to stammer something about her poverty. I remember getting off a prodigious phrase about the honor being mine. Oh, I was princely, my dear Rickham. I was posing to myself like one of my own sitters. Then I was taken up and left alone with him. I had sent all my traps in advance, and I had only to set up the easel and get to work. He had been dead only 24 hours, and he died suddenly of a heart disease, so that there had been no preliminary work of destruction. His face was clear and untouched. I had met him once or twice years before and thought of him as insignificant and dingy. Now I saw that he was superb. I was glad at first with a merely aesthetic satisfaction, glad to have my hand on such a subject. Then his strange lifelikeness began to affect me queerly. As I blocked the head in, I felt as if he were watching me do it. The sensation was followed by the thought, if he were watching me, what would he say to my way of working? My strokes began to go a little wild. I felt nervous and uncertain. Once, when I looked up, I seemed to see a smile behind his closed grayish beard, as if he had a secret, and that he were amusing himself by holding it back from me. That exasperated me still more. The secret! Why, I had a secret worth 20 of his. I dashed at the canvas furiously and tried some of my bravura tricks, but they failed me. They crumbled. I saw that he wasn't watching the showy bits. I couldn't distract his attention, and he just kept his eyes on the hard passages between. Those were the ones I had always shirked or covered up with some lying paint. And how he saw through my lies. I looked up again and caught sight of that sketch of the donkey hanging on the wall near his bed. His wife told me afterward it was the last thing he had done, just a note taken with a shaking hand, when he was down in Devonshire recovering from a previous heart attack. Just a note, but it tells the whole history. There are years of patient, scornful persistence in every line. A man who has swum with the current could never have learned that mighty upstream stroke. I turned my back to my work, and I went on groping and muddling. Then I looked at that donkey again. I saw that when Stroud had laid in the first stroke, he knew just what the end would be. He had possessed his subject, absorbed it, recreated it. When had I done that with any of my things? They hadn't been born of me. I had just adopted them. Hang it, Rickham! With that face watching me, I couldn't do another stroke. The plain truth was, I didn't know where to put it. I had never known. Only with my sitters and my public a showy splash of color covered up the fact that I just threw paint into their faces. Well, paint was the one medium those dead eyes could see through, see straight up to the tottering foundations underneath. Don't you know how, in talking a foreign language, even fluently, one says half the time not what one wants to say, but what one can? Well, that's the way I painted. And as he lay there and watched me, the thing they call my technique collapsed like a house of cards. He didn't sneer, you understand. Poor Stroud, he just lay there quietly watching, and on his lips, through the gray beard, I seemed to hear the question, are you sure you know where you're coming out? If I could have painted that face with that question on it, I should have done a great thing. The next greatest thing was to see that I couldn't, and that grace was given me. But oh, at that minute, Rickham, was there anything on earth I wouldn't have given to have Stroud alive before me, and to hear him say, it's not too late. I'll show you how. It was too late. It would have been, even if he'd been alive. I packed up my traps and went down and told Mrs. Stroud. Of course, I didn't tell her that. It would have been Greek to her. I simply said I couldn't paint him, that I was too moved. She rather liked the idea. She's so romantic. It was that made her give me the donkey. But she was terribly upset at not getting the portrait. She did want him done by someone showy. At first I was afraid she wouldn't let me off, and at my wits' end I suggested Grindle. Yes, it was I who started Grindle. I told Mrs. Stroud he was the coming man, and she told somebody else, and so it got to be true. And he painted Stroud without wincing, and she hung the picture among her husband's things. He flung himself down into the armchair near mine, laid back his head, and clasping his arms beneath it, looked up at the picture above the chimney piece. I like to fancy that Stroud himself would have given it to me if he'd been able to say what he thought that day. And in answer to a question I put half mechanically, begin again, he flashed out, when the one thing that brings me anywhere near him is that I knew enough to leave off. He stood up and laid his hand on my shoulder with a laugh. Only the irony is that I am still painting, since Grindle's doing it for me. The Strouds stand alone and happen once. But there's no exterminating our kind of art. The end. There's 3 points that I'd like to make. One is he had, Jack Gisburn, at the very beginning, it says, in the height of his glory, he had dropped his painting, married a rich widow, and established himself in a villa on the Riviera. So Rickham, the narrator, is really wondering he wants to get to the bottom of this story. The women who had sat for him are kind of pleased that their own portraits, because he has quit, will now go up in value. It says they had been denied the solace of saying that it was Mrs. Gisburn, that had dragged him down, because she had not even appeared on the scene until a year after he had made that decision. But they did kind of soothe themselves by saying that his new wife, had failed to lift him up, failed to kind of lead him back to the easel. So a little bit of accusing there, just slightly. Second point is I appreciate the way that I made notes for myself here, that Edith Wharton is able to describe art using aptly chosen words. Some of her sentences are very, very rich and kind of do the job. Here's an example of one. All the characteristic qualities came out, all the hesitations disguised as audacities, the tricks of prestidigitation by which, with such consummate skill, he managed to divert attention from the real business of the picture to some pretty irrelevance of detail. So that's kind of telling you that the art was flashy and attention grabbing, but not really truly genius, according to the writing. The third point is Gisburn has been commissioned to paint the man who had just died, named Stroud. He is an artist. In Gisburn's mind, he is a true artist. When he goes to do it for his widow, who he calls a simpleton, in so doing, while painting, he's just unable to do it. All he can see and all he can hear in his mind, I think, is this dead artist saying to him, I don't think you know what you're doing, so to speak. So he goes to the widow and he says to her, I was too filled and overcome with feeling and was unable to complete the job. But he recommended a fellow named Victor Grindle. Victor Grindle is sort of the hot new artist. He's making the rounds. He's doing what Gisburn used to do. And when he's speaking of this to Rickham, he says, the irony is that I'll just read it from here. Only the irony of it is that I am still painting, since Grindle's doing it for me. The Strouds stand alone and happen once, but there is no exterminating our kind of art. Our meaning his and Grindle's, what he considers the fraud kind or the cheap, easy kind. And Grindle's out there doing it, and because he learned from Gisburn himself, he's saying that his own art lives on in that way. Well, I hope you like the book or the story, and if you have any input, I'd love to hear it. And so feel free to let me know. Have a good week.